Welcome to the research desk.
Glad to be here.
So, imagine you are driving 60 miles an hour down a busy suburban thoroughfare. Your radio is playing, your mind is, lingering on a meeting you just left, and you are surrounded by this totally chaotic visual field.
Right. Billboards, pedestrians, storefronts, the usual mess.
Exactly. And suddenly, a red light flares at the intersection ahead. Now, before your conscious brain even processes the geometric shape of that traffic signal, before you internally articulate the English word stop, your foot is already moving toward the brake pedal.
Yeah, it is basically a reflex.
It is. You are reacting to a signal that sits at this really fascinating intersection of physics, psychology, and culture. So, the issue we are examining today is the fundamental nature of color as a communicative tool. We are asking a seemingly simple but incredibly deep question.
Does color possess a direct, pre-verbal human force on its own, or does it only acquire its meaning through context, culture, memory, and relational systems?
Precisely. And the position I am putting forward today is the bull case. I argue that color functions as a direct human signal, functioning beneath and before language. Long before a specific hue is subjected to, cultural analysis or sociological interpretation, it acts as a blunt physiological sensation.
And I am going to have to heavily stress test that with the bear case. My perspective is that pure, uncontextualized color is an absolute fiction. Its semantic force is entirely socially produced, historically contingent, and context-dependent.
But it creates shared physiological baselines. It orients the human body and the nervous system before culture ever has the opportunity to intervene. Color is not a blank screen awaiting societal projection. It is a profound biological trigger.
Look, physics can measure a wavelength with extraordinary precision, right? We can say exactly where a specific shade of red sits on the electromagnetic spectrum. But physics cannot locate a unit of meaning within that measurement. To suggest that color possesses an intrinsic communicative essence is to mistake a biological mechanism for a linguistic one.
Well, let us stay with the scenario of the driver approaching the intersection to examine the raw mechanics here. If we look at the logic of the stop signal case, we are forced to ask why traffic systems operate with such uniform success across the globe.
Convention. We all go to driving school.
Sure, convention plays a part. We are taught the rules of the road. But these systems transcend linguistic barriers. They survive completely different cultural histories. The immediate visceral salience of red is undeniable. It commands attention and shapes action faster than conscious words can be processed by the cerebral cortex.
But is that meaning, or is that just an optical reflex?
It is an immediate trigger of arousal and urgency. When that red light illuminates, the reaction is not a slow semantic decoding process where the brain says, that is red, and in this jurisdiction, red means I must halt. Evolutionarily speaking, the human eye developed to spot the ripest fruit among a dense canopy of green leaves, or to instantly recognize the threat of spilled blood.
Okay, but
let me just finish this thought. The hue bypasses the slower deliberative pathways of the brain and acts almost directly on the motor systems. This proves color possesses an inherent capacity to arrest human attention. It functions as an evolutionary alarm bell, completely regardless of whether the viewer was raised in Tokyo, Berlin, or Buenos Aires.
You are accurately describing a biological mechanism of arousal. I will give you that. But the crucial error in that framework is labeling that arousal as meaning. We must maintain a strict boundary between measurable physics and unstable semantics.
How can an evolutionary alarm bell not have meaning?
Because physics defines the wavelength, it does not define the message. To clarify this, let us apply the protocol versus signal analogy. In any sophisticated communication system, whether it is a computer network or a city grid, color acts like a protocol.
A protocol?
Yes, a protocol is not meaningful by its own essence. It is only actionable within a robust framework. The universality of the stop signal is not intrinsic to the specific hue of red. It is an engineered universality.
But it relies on the biology.
The system leverages the physiological fact you just described that red causes visual arousal, but then the system strictly defines what that arousal requires the user to do. The meaning, which is the instruction to stop a 2-ton vehicle, is entirely provided by the legal and infrastructural architecture of the traffic grid.
That feels like a semantic technicality.
Not at all. We see this principle applied everywhere in user interfaces, industrial safety systems, aviation dashboards. When an aircraft manufacturer designs a cockpit, they rely heavily on the physiological attention-grabbing power of high-contrast colors. If cabin pressure drops, a red light flashes.
Right, which proves it is a powerful sensory tool.
It is an incredibly effective sensory tool to grab attention, but a tool for capturing attention is not a fixed dictionary word. The red light on an aviation dashboard means catastrophic failure, but the red light on an office coffee machine means heating complete. The arousal is physiological. The meaning is entirely contextual.
Okay, but what happens when we remove the protocol? If we transition away from the high-stakes, strictly defined world of industrial safety and legal compliance, and we move into the realm of immersive human emotion, the limitations of your protocol argument become quite clear.
I am not sure I follow. Where are we moving to?
We do not only experience color when an instruction manual tells us what it means. Look at the canonical example of Mark Rothko's chapel murals in Houston, Texas. If color only possessed meaning through strict systemic protocols, these murals would be completely incomprehensible to the thousands of people who visit them.
The Rothko Chapel.
Yes, the physical reality of the Rothko murals is staggering. You walk into an octagonal room, and you are surrounded by 14 massive panels. They are fields of dark plum, purplish black, and deep bruised crimson. They are spare to the point of absolute refusal.
There is nothing else to look at.
Exactly. There are no figures to interpret. There are no narrative scenes to decode. Almost no compositional events to guide the eye. Yet viewers who sit in that space routinely report overwhelming experiences of grief, transcendence, or dread.
People do have very strong reactions there.
Right. So we must ask why individuals from vastly different cultural backgrounds frequently break down in tears before a flat plane of dark red paint. It is not because they are reading a socially constructed protocol. The murals do not act like text. They act like weather.
Like weather?
Yes, murals acting like weather. You do not read a thunderstorm. You are subjected to it. The sheer scale and saturation of the color physically fatigue the retina. It alters the viewer's self-awareness. It slows the physical body down and thickens the perception of time. The color is acting directly on the nervous system.
That response is undeniably profound, but attributing that emotional weight to the unmediated power of color completely ignores the immense institutional framing at work. The visitor at the Rothko Chapel does not encounter those dark plum canvases in a vacuum.
They are literally just canvases on a wall.
By the time they stand before the paint, they have been deeply preconditioned. They are conditioned by the brutalist, tomb-like architecture of the building itself, which immediately signals solemnity. They are conditioned by the prestige of the international art world.
Which tells them it is important art, sure.
More than important. The art world has certified the space as a site of profound psychological importance before the visitor even buys a plane ticket to Texas. When they cross the threshold, they enter a space that demands sacred silence, directly mirroring the behavioral protocols of a religious sanctuary.
I think you are vastly overstating the building's influence over the physical paint.
Think about it this way. If you were to take those exact same canvases with the exact same wavelength of plum and crimson and hang them in the brightly lit, chaotic atrium of a commercial shopping mall, they would not induce tears. They would look like decorative panels. The grief or transcendence the viewer feels is not emanating from the wavelength of the paint. It is orchestrated by the entire architectural, spatial, and social apparatus surrounding it.
To isolate the power of the hue from the architecture is to misunderstand the nature of the medium being deployed. We are not just talking about paint on a wall. Let us examine James Turrell's Roden crater.
Oh, the volcano project in Arizona.
Yes, an extinct volcanic cinder cone in the painted desert of northern Arizona that Turrell has spent decades transforming into a naked eye observatory. In Turrell's work, light itself is the medium. He manipulates the celestial light entering the subterranean spaces so that the sky appears as a solid, tangible surface of color.
Okay, but again, highly orchestrated environment.
But meaning here does not arise from depicted objects, and it certainly does not arise from institutional plaques on a museum wall. It arises from calibrated changes in luminance, the shifting color of the atmosphere, and the bodily orientation of the viewer.
Right, the viewer is placed in a very specific position.
Exactly. When you sit in one of Turrell's viewing rooms as the sun sets, the sky framed in the aperture shifts from a pale blue to a deep, hyper-saturated violet. The viewer does not read the work in any conventional sense. They are repositioned by it. The environment becomes the syntax.
The environment becomes the syntax? I actually like that phrasing, but it proves my point.
How so?
The color of the light alters the threshold of perception, creating a pre-verbal condition that forces a physical and emotional recalibration. The institutional framing you mentioned may guide the viewer out into the desert, but once they are inside that crater, it is the raw, immersive physics of the light that dictates the physiological awe.
Even the journey to Roden crater proves my point. It requires an intentional, arduous pilgrimage. The viewer goes into the desert specifically expecting a revelation, and therefore they experience one.
That is terribly cynical.
To dismantle the romantic idea of universal, uncontextualized meaning, we do not need to look at esoteric art installations anyway. We only need to look at anthropology and global markets. The severe cultural contradictions regarding color completely undermine the premise of universal physiological translation.
Cultural contradictions like what?
Let us look again at the color red, the hue you introduced as a universal alarm bell. In many Western settings, red signifies love, passion, and vitality. It is the color of Valentine's Day and romance. Yet, in parts of South Africa, red is explicitly the color of mourning and profound loss tied to historical bloodshed.
Well, yes, historical associations vary.
It is not just red. In China, red signifies prosperity, good fortune, and celebration. Let us look at white. In the West, it is historically bound to concepts of purity, innocence, and marriage. In China and Japan, white is the color of death, mourning, and the spectral realm.
So you were saying the physical color means nothing?
I am saying if the meaning of a color was physically preordained by its wavelength, if it was dictating a universal emotional baseline, these semantic inversions simply would not exist. A biological baseline cannot simultaneously mean joyous celebration and profound grief unless the meaning is being actively mapped onto the color by the culture, rather than emanating from the physics of the light.
Look, I concede that the dictionary definition of a color, the explicit label a society places on it, shifts across borders. Semantic inversion is a documented reality. But semantic inversion does not negate physiological impact. It merely layers upon it.
It does much more than layer upon it. It fundamentally dictates the human response, often with severe financial consequences when ignored. Consider the economic cost of assuming color possesses a universal, biological meaning.
You mean in corporate branding?
Exactly. In the early 2000s, a Western pharmaceutical company launched a new over-the-counter painkiller in the Japanese market. The packaging was designed using a specific, dominant shade of blue.
Blue is everywhere in medical packaging here.
Right. In Western medical branding, blue is a ubiquitous shorthand. It signifies trust, clinical efficacy, cleanliness, and scientific authority. You see it on hospitals, on medical scrubs, on pharmacy logos. The manufacturer assumed this visual logic would translate perfectly because, according to the physiological argument, blue should universally calm the nervous system.
And I assume it did not translate.
The product launched, and it struggled immensely in Japan. It was a massive failure. Subsequent consumer research revealed the specific data point that destroyed their strategy. Local Japanese consumers read that specific shade of blue as cold, uninviting, and deeply sad.
Oh, sad? Really?
Yes, we have to look at the psychology of the user here. When a person is in physical pain, they are seeking comfort, warmth, and relief. The blue packaging visually signaled a chilling isolation. The chemical composition of the pill inside the box was identical to the highly successful Western version. The physics of the blue wavelength printed on the cardboard were identical, but the semantic reality was entirely different, resulting in a costly market failure.
Okay, The pharmaceutical case study actually forces a critical refinement of our terms. It demands that we introduce what we can call the wildcard distinction.
The wildcard distinction?
Yes, we must separate semantic universality, which, as your examples of red, white, and blue clearly demonstrate, does not exist, from embodied reliability, which absolutely does exist.
Elaborate on that.
Let us look closely at what actually happens with that painkiller. A color can reliably heighten arousal or induce a sense of coldness without universally meaning the exact same thing in a social context. The Japanese consumers experienced the blue as cold. That is a physiological sensory association.
Right, it felt cold.
In the West, that exact same sensory experience of coldness is interpreted conceptually as clinical sterility and safety. In Japan, that same sensory coldness was interpreted conceptually as sadness and isolation.
Ah, I see what you were doing.
The underlying sensory transmission of coldness was constant across both populations. It was the cultural application of that sensation that inverted. This synthesis shows that color operates as a highly reliable physiological anchor. It delivers a consistent physical sensation around which different cultures construct vastly different narratives.
That synthesis only holds if we pretend history does not permanently alter the optics. Geopolitical nuance proves that once history touches a color, it is never merely optical again.
History does not rewrite human biology.
It overwrites the physiological anchor you describe with trauma, memory, and political events. Contrast the American Red Scare during the Cold War with the contemporary use of blue and yellow in Ukraine.
Two very different political eras.
Exactly. During the Cold War, red was weaponized in the United States. It was not just a signal for arousal. It represented existential dread, communist infiltration, and the potential collapse of democracy. That association completely bypassed the physical reality of the color and attached itself to a historical terror.
But that is just a temporary political brand.
Is it? Today, blue and yellow represent sovereign resistance, resilience, and national survival in Ukraine. If you look at a blue and yellow flag today, you cannot separate the optical experience of those colors from the geopolitical reality they now index. The history hijacks the optic nerve. A color is an artifact of its time, not a timeless biological constant.
That line of reasoning treats color as a passive victim of historical events, a blank canvas waiting for politics to paint over it. But color is an active participant with its own deeply embedded structural grammar.
A grammar based on what?
To understand this structural grammar, we cannot look at a color in isolation, which is where the historical argument falls short. We must look at the interactions between colors, which leads us directly to the foundational work of Josef Albers.
I am so glad you brought up Albers. Josef Albers and his seminal text, Interaction of Color, actually deliver the fatal blow to naive color universalism.
How could you possibly read Albers that way?
Because Albers proved through exhaustive, empirical demonstration that a color changes entirely depending on its neighbors. Ask anyone to look at an object in their room right now, a coffee mug, a pillow. The side hitting the light is one color. The side in shadow is an entirely different hue.
Well, yes, light changes perception.
Albers demonstrated this in a controlled environment. He showed that a single physically identical gray square will look distinctly bluish when placed against a yellow background. Yet that exact same physical gray square will look heavy, dark, and almost brown when placed against a stark white background.
Which highlights the physiological mechanics of the eye.
It highlights that if the human eye literally cannot perceive an isolated hue accurately because of the surrounding contrast, then the concept of an isolated hue carrying any inherent universal meaning is a biological fiction. Color acts precisely like music. Color is a note inside a chord progression.
A note inside a chord progression.
Right. A middle C played on a piano does not inherently mean triumph. It does not inherently mean grief. It is just a specific frequency of sound vibrating in the air. Its meaning only emerges from the interval, how it relates to the note played before it and the note played after it. Without the progression, the note is empty. Without the adjacent hues, the color is meaningless.
You know, Albers does not destroy the argument for color's inherent power. He actually provides the exact mechanism that strengthens the physiological case.
I do not see how.
If color interaction can reliably create specific psychological states, it proves that color possesses an intrinsic emotional grammar that is hardwired into our biology. When Albers shows us that a cold blue placed immediately beside a harsh saturated orange creates visual tension, an actual uncomfortable vibration on the retina, he is demonstrating a physiological truth, not a cultural one.
But the interpretation of that tension is cultural.
When muted wood tones placed beside warm grays universally communicate serenity across vastly different architectural traditions, it is because that specific interval of light absorption physically relaxes the optic nerve. This is not an arbitrary social construction. We have to look at the underlying neuroscience here.
What does the neuroscience actually say about intervals?
And Mallet and colleagues in 2023 have consistently investigated how we process visual information. They study a phenomenon known as lateral inhibition.
Lateral inhibition.
Yes, when a photoreceptor in your retina detects light, it fires a signal to your brain, but simultaneously, it sends an inhibitory signal to its immediate neighboring receptors, telling them to suppress their own firing. This means that if you have a bright color next to a dark color, the bright side looks even brighter and the dark side looks even darker right at the boundary.
So the eye is forcing the contrast.
The eye is physically forcing contrast. Color cognition is deeply tied to how these relational contrasts trigger neurological responses before the brain even has a chance to interpret them. The body receives this relational grammar first. The hardware of the eye processes the interval. Culture elaborates on it later. The chord progression works precisely because our biology is tuned to respond to those specific intervals.
The physiological mechanics of lateral inhibition explain how the eye perceives an edge, but the interval itself, what that edge signifies, is still culturally interpreted.
Let us test both of our theories against a single high-stakes corporate failure.
The Tropicana United States orange juice redesign of 2009. This case study perfectly isolates what happens when you alter the visual grammar of a deeply established product, and it requires us to look at the exact mechanisms of consumer behavior.
The Tropicana catastrophe is indeed the perfect crucible for this discussion. Let us detail the aesthetic shift that took place in the boardroom and on the grocery shelves.
Set the scene for us.
Tropicana was a dominant, trusted brand in the American market. In 2009, they decided to completely strip away their highly familiar visual identity. For years, the carton featured a very specific image, a vibrant, textured orange with a red and white striped straw protruding directly out of the fruit.
It was incredibly recognizable.
It was literal, it was heavily saturated, and it was highly associative. It communicated the physical reality of the fruit. Well, the design agency replaced this with a stark, hyper-modern visual system. They removed the orange entirely.
Which was a bold choice for an orange juice company.
They attempted to rely on the pure color of the juice itself, isolated in a clear glass, rather than the heavily contextualized relational image of the fruit with the straw.
And the commercial impact of relying on that pure, abstracted color was absolute devastation. When this new packaging hit the grocery aisles, Tropicana sales fell by roughly 20% in the span of about 2 months.
20%.
To put that in perspective, that drop cost the brand approximately $30 million in direct sales.
Wow. And that is entirely independent of the millions of dollars spent on the design agency and the marketing campaign to launch it. The backlash was so immediate and so severe that they were forced to completely abandon the new design and revert to the original packaging almost immediately.
We must analyze exactly why this happened, because it acts as the ultimate verdict on everything we are discussing today. Tropicana did not lose its market dominance because the physical color orange suddenly stopped meaning freshness or citrus to the American consumer.
No, the physical wavelength of the color representing the juice was still present on the carton.
In fact, it was more prominent than ever. It failed because the color was completely detached from the object memory layout system that made it instantly legible. Imagine a shopper moving rapidly down a grocery aisle. They are scanning a massive wall of refrigerated products. They have perhaps 3 seconds to make a visual identification.
Right? The shopper's brain in that 3-second window was not looking for the pure wavelength of orange liquid. It was looking for the specific relational syntax
it had memorized over years of consumption.
The green of the leaf, the dimpled skin.
The green of the leaf, the textured skin of the orange, the stark contrasting red of the straw, and the bold, familiar typography anchoring the top.
The new design had the color, but it lost its syntax. It expected the color alone to do the heavy lifting of the entire symbol.
The unit of communication is not the wavelength, it is the relation. That is a vital point of convergence for us. Whether we approach this from the physiological necessity of visual contrast, the lateral inhibition in the eye that Albers intuitively understood and Conway later documented, or the sociological reality of memory and expectation as Tropicana so expensively discovered, the conclusion is the same. The isolated hue is powerless without its structural framing.
This brings us to the practical implications for those shaping our visual environments. For decision makers, designers, and strategists, the lessons are clear and unforgiving.
What is the primary lesson?
First, you must prototype in real conditions. Testing a color scheme on a perfectly calibrated, backlit monitor in a sterile design studio is a dangerous illusion if the product will actually be viewed under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lighting of a pharmacy or the warm, shifting ambient light of a living room. As Albers proved, the relational contrast changes the exact moment the environmental lighting changes.
Furthermore, architects and spatial designers must treat immersive light as an environmental grammar, not as a decorative afterthought. As we saw with Turrell's Roden crater and the Rothko chapel, spatial orientation, scale, and time are inextricably linked to the perception of color.
You cannot just replicate it with a paint swab.
Exactly. You cannot replicate the emotional weight and physiological impact of a cathedral by simply painting a small, cramped room the same shade of stone. The architecture and the color must act as a unified syntax.
Above all, strategists must stop treating isolated hue as a universal, translatable strategy. The pharmaceutical case in Japan, where blue signified isolation instead of trust, and the semantic inversion of white as purity versus white as mourning should serve as permanent warnings. A color says absolutely nothing on its own. It only begins to speak when it is staged within a culture, an architecture, and a specific human history.
As our environments become increasingly digitized, we are left with a critical, forward-looking question. How is our relentless reliance on glowing, backlit digital interfaces, where colors emit light directly into the eye rather than reflecting off physical surfaces, flattening or perhaps entirely rewriting the ancient relational grammar of color we have discussed today? Are we losing the nuance of the physical interval in favor of algorithmic saturation?
This is the Research Desk officially signing off.